Welcome to The Teaching Curve, a podcast exploring the pedagogy of global politics and international studies. Produced under the auspices of the innovative Pedagogy initiative of the International Studies Association and made available through ISA's Professional Resource Center. I'm Jamie Free, Professor of Global Politics and Associate Provost at Whitman College. Each episode of The Teaching Curve is a conversation with an engaged and innovative teacher of international studies. The goal is to celebrate and inspire pedagogical creativity by exploring how similarities and differences in how teachers, scholars of global politics practice our craft. Conversations about teaching can inspire us to teach better, both by listening to how others make sense of their responsibilities and asking us to articulate how we do so. Today's conversation is with Dr. Shampa Biswas, Paul Garret Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Politics Department at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, in the United States. Shampa teaches introductory and upper-level undergraduate courses at the intersections of international politics, security, hierarchies, and gender. Our conversation explores the balance of professional authority and student agency in teaching and advising, whether to share one's own political dispositions with students, and tactics for activating students' personal relationships to the global. Shampa Biswas, thank you very much for joining us on The Teaching Curve. I'm excited to talk to you.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I always like everybody to have a little bit of context for where you're coming from. And so I would appreciate if you could just tell us a little bit about your institution, but mostly by telling us who your students are.
Okay. Well, I teach in a small private liberal arts college in Eastern Washington, in actually a small rural town in Eastern Washington, which I think is important to what I do. My students come primarily from the Northwest United States, but we do have students from all across the country as well as from the rest of the world. My students are, I think about 60% of our student body is white, about 20% is domestic minority students, and roughly 10%, I think a little bit less, are international students. But most importantly, my students are intellectually curious, smart, they work hard.
What kind of class size do you have? Usually I'm at a liberal arts college too, we always think about that as having a lot of good student-faculty interaction. Do you think that's fair for your school?
That is. Class sizes are from, my biggest class is an introductory class, which is about 30 students, capped at 30 students. I'll have a few more sometimes. And my seminars are roughly 15 students. So they're small, they're intimate. I get to know my students fairly well, sometimes more than I would like to, or more than maybe they want me to know them. Mm-hmm. But it's a pretty tight community.
Who influenced you in how you decided to be a teacher?
I don't know that it was a moment. I don't know that I even decided to be a teacher. I think I fell into it mostly. I think I became a teacher or sort of learned how to teach from being in classrooms with other teachers who I found inspirational. So I learned from them, although I don't think I was sort of mimicking them or copying them deliberately. But as I recall, as I think back to sort of the things I did in my classroom, I think that's where I learned the tricks I did. And then I've taught for over a couple of decades. I've watched a lot of my colleagues teach, and I've picked up a lot from that. So I teach differently from a lot of my colleagues, but I always learn something about the way they carry themselves in the classroom. Sometimes just techniques, sometimes just tricks to get students to engage. Other times, just even the way they the kind of relationships they build in the classroom with their students, or the ways they carry themselves physically within a space.
I agree with you. One of the things that's so special about teaching at an institution like yours or mine is that there's a lot of opportunities to go see people who teach in very different disciplines. I remember going to see someone teach to write a letter for their tenure file. It was a math professor, and thinking just how differently he had to structure his class in order to get all the students to a certain threshold by the time they left.
Yes.
And if he didn't do that, he wasn't going to be able to go on in the next class. And that wasn't something that I considered very important. I'd get him next time on the next war or famine or genocide or whatever it was,
Right. No, absolutely. Although I think we do some of that too, but not in that explicit way. Because some of what I think when I start teaching is having a shared vocabulary. It's like learning a language, so we can all actually have a conversation in which we are talking about the same thing. And that may be similar to, knowing how to add and subtract before you can get on to the other skills. But I agree with you. It's a very different, the techniques are really different.
And to think about it from a student's perspective, right? They have sometimes 10 minutes walking between classes to shift their mindset from the way I need them to interact and to think in a class and the way he does. And then they go to a theater class or a pottery class, which is very different.
Yeah.
So when you are thinking about how your teaching differs from how other people do, how would you want your students to describe you as a teacher?
I would like them to think about me as somebody who brings myself fully to the classroom, who cares about them as individuals and cares about their intellectual growth. I would like them to not think of me as somebody who comes in with a preset agenda, that I want them to think a particular way. And I think I mostly succeed in that. I tell them constantly that I don't want them to try to read my mind, both in the classroom and in stuff they write for me. So not to try to guess what it is that they think I want them to say. So I want them to think that I actually do care about who they are as intellectuals and who they are becoming as intellectuals, and that I take them seriously as intellectuals and are willing to disagree with them and have them disagree with me. And that's always a process.
For sure. I mean, your society has given you more authority than they have in the classroom in many ways. And so when you're navigating that tension between the authority that in many cases students come into college kind of over authoritizing the faculty members, when what we're trying to get them to do, as you say, is to express themselves and to think of themselves as also authoring their own perspectives on these things. How do you navigate that tension?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky balance. So on the one hand, I don't think of the classroom as a democratic space. And I think I disagree with some colleagues on that. So, students are not my friends. I'm not there to be their friends. I don't think we're equal players in the classroom. And I think pretending to be that is dishonest. I mean, so I carry authority. I wield power. And I know that, and I know that enough to know that I need to wield it responsibly. I know that students know that I wield that power, right? And so the balance is to not let that get in the way of them expressing their thoughts and the way they understand the world. So I don't want to deny my power, and I play, I don't know if I would call it a heavy-handed role in the classroom, but I'm very much present. I rarely make myself absent from the classroom. even when I rely heavily on student discussions. So I'm a pretty prominent presence in the classroom, even when I rely on discussion leaders to do the work of getting students to talk. So I'm very much conscious of my power, but I'm also conscious of wielding it in a way that does not silence other students. So I think there are techniques for that. It's I mean, I have learned some over time. I don't always succeed. Um, so that it's a process, I think.
Over the course of your teaching experience, have you come to find tactics or techniques that you used and now avoid? That some things that you would just say, look, that's not for me.
I lectured more when I first started teaching. Um, I do less of that in part because I think it's even in my intro classes, um, because it's harder to sustain student attention during a long lecture. But I think I'm just not as effective as lecturing as some of my. I've seen lecturers who are amazing and who can keep people's attention through an hour of lecture. I'm not one of those people. So I know not to do that too much. So my lectures, even when I do lectures, they're bite-sized lectures. Um, I think, and I'm better at running discussions or being able to convey some of the content I might want to through lectures via discussion. So I think I do less of that. But I would still like to get better at lecturing. I think it's a skill to continue to work on. Um,
No, I'm with you, especially because for many of my students coming out of a high school situation where that was the definition of education, right? Is the interaction between a teacher and a student was that kind of lecture mentality that it's disruptive to their sense of what I'm supposed to be doing, what they're supposed to be doing. If we, if I don't do at least some of that component of the class. They're all willing to go along with me to be pushed into new directions, but I also have the sense that they really want me to tell them some of the things from my perspective, are true about the world.
yeah, students always, at least some students always want that. I'll see that in the evaluations. I wish we had heard more from the professor. Um, yeah, but I'm not sure that I want to cater to that, but I think students do. They also want to know what I'm thinking on something, which I'm not willing to reveal. Um, you know, and I'm okay with that. Um,
Me too, actually. I have a lot of, um, I tell them that I want them to walk out with no idea what my personal opinions about things are.
yeah,
And it's almost like a challenge at some points when I tell them that, right? Then they're like, okay, I'm going to figure free out. I'm going to figure out what he knows and what he thinks. But I find it, especially for me, when I walk in with all of the privileges that society provides, I'm worried about my opinion either seeming too powerful to go against, or oh, Free's got this for me. He thinks the same way I do. I'm going to let him go,
right.
So I'm worried about that. And I'm just more like, I'm going to push everybody.
Yeah, that's how I approach it too. I want them to sort of approach the world through a lot of different lenses, and think through them carefully, and telling them what I think gets in the way of that. So at the end of my introductory class last semester, because we were online, I actually did a poll, asking them, Professor Biswas is a realist, a liberal, etc. And it was pretty evenly split. So I thought mission accomplished.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's good. Um, and then, of course, you didn't tell them what the answer was after that
No,
either.
of course not. Yeah. And there isn't an answer, actually. I mean, I don't sort of pigeonhole myself into one of those camps in any sort of clear cut way.
Tell me about the way that teaching at your institution, you said it's kind of Eastern Washington, mostly white students with some wealth, not all, but how does that affect their understanding of and relationship to the global, the international, the stuff that you're bringing that they may not have a very good understanding of?
So I think about international relations as a series of encounters, historical encounters, contemporary encounters that have shaped us, shaped our worlds. And I want my students to think about the encounters that have shaped their lives as global encounters, regardless of where they live and where they have grown up, right? So I teach in a small rural town. By some accounts, it's represented as an insular, isolated space. Sometimes students think of it that way. Many students who come from city lives think of it as sort of isolated from the world. And yet we know it's not, right? Mm-hmm. Not only is it not now in that, things that we eat or wear or our conceptions of other people's lives and worlds that shape our aspirations to the good life are all global. Not just in this moment, but at least in Eastern Washington have been for at least 150 years, if not more, right? Through global migration patterns, through missionary activity, through wars that the United States has fought elsewhere, right? Through movement of trade and capital. So I want them to all appreciate the ways that their lives are all global, regardless of who they are, where they come from. Even if they live in spaces that they consider isolated. We do get students from also rural areas who think that they have lived a very sort of isolated life. And what I also want them to then sort of grapple with, and this gets me to the discipline of IR to the extent that I engage with the discipline at all, is that how we understand those encounters. There are different interpretations of those encounters that different folks carry, and that shapes the way they live they live their lives and what they do in the world, right? Which is why it matters. To me, the question of, for instance, whether realism accurately describes the world or not is, it's a silly question to ask. The question is, if there are folks who carry, and especially powerful folks, who carry a conception of realism in their heads, which affects the things they do in the world, it matters, right? And our students need to understand that. Regardless of who my students are, I want them to have a conception of the global, and I want them to have have an understanding of what are the conceptions of the global that other people carry around, and how that shapes the world around them. And power and privilege is a big part of it, of course.
Agreed. Now, I think that that's a really good way to put it, because what you end up with is students who walked in with a vague sense of the outside or the other, and at least when I'm successful, they walk out of classes thinking of themselves as a component of a thing that spans all of humanity in some ways, and they can think about the intersections that are there that before were just, hidden's the wrong word, ignored or just not noticed, because because what they're trying to get at is who are they in this emergingly, even increasingly globalized world. And that's the answer to that includes a lot of relationships that they have not been paying attention to.
Right. And that also then sort of obligates them to be responsible citizens of the world, right? So isolationism is not an option, really, right? So some of my American students, I mostly have American students, And most of them sort of think of them, this goes to the question of who my students are, and how that shapes how I teach. Most of them think of themselves as left liberal, right? I mean, they have a conception of themselves as certain kinds of political beings. And part of my job as a teacher is to scratch the surface and see, really just, what are your underlying assumptions? How left liberal are you really? And what does that entail, right? And many of them their aspiration is to change the world, which is what American parents tell their children from when they're little, especially American liberal parents. And I want to tell them, no, if you think that America has been an interventionist force in the world not for the good often, perhaps Americans need to sort of step back from the role that they've played in the world. Maybe it's not your responsibility to change the world, but that does not mean that you get to live parochial lives, because there is an obligation from living in a world in which you have had an impact, and in which your lives are connected with the lives of those really far away from you, right? So what does it mean to live ethical lives as citizens of whichever country you are, in which you are constantly encountering others, whether or not you know them?
Well, and that's a really good juxtaposition, right? Because we were talking before about how part of our role as faculty members is to give our students agency, to feel like they can express their opinions. And yet they have to, you're also saying, be careful with that agency, right? That your ability to make change in the world or to express ideas that could go on to influence a lot of, you got to exercise that responsibly.
Yes. And my job is to have them question whatever beliefs they come up with, or give them the tools to question them. Not to tell them that you should go down this path, you should or should not do that. But if this is what you think you should do, let's think that through a little more carefully.
Well, that's really good, because that also gets at your role of being ambiguous about your own beliefs in the world, to again be able to push on everybody in the in similar ways.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure you get those students too who come to your office hours and say, "Oh, should I go to do the Peace Corps? There's this job ahead that require like teaching English abroad. Should I do that, or would that be a colonialist action?" And I'm not going to tell you. That's not, I can't answer that question for you. You have to think this through.
And that's, as you know, and you would say to them, that's more of a service to you than me telling you what to do is not telling you. That's a service to you, to be able to go and figure that out.
Yeah. No, I tell them it's a lazy question.
Fair enough.
It's not my job contract says I'm supposed to, give you sleepless nights over every decision you make, but not to answer that question.
That's good. Yeah. I tell them my job is to confuse them, because that's, then they'll spend the time to figure it out. And that's really the goal of education, is to authorize and to give them the tools to be able to go think those things through. So. Well, Shampa, this has been a great conversation. I find myself lighter having talked to somebody with a kindred job and a kindred spirit about those things. I appreciate you taking the time to share the wisdom of your lived experience of being a teacher and helping us understand a little bit more about how you approach those things, because that's really helpful for everybody who's trying to figure out their own path.
Thank you. This was fun.
The Teaching Curve podcast is made available in the ISA Professional Resource Center under the auspices of the Innovative Pedagogy Initiative. You can send feedback or suggestions for future interviews to teachingcurve@isanet.org. Follow us on Twitter @TeachingCurve. Thanks everybody for joining us on the Teaching Curve, and remember, learn something every time you teach.